What's going on, everyone? Brandon here from TruckSafe Consulting. In this video, we're going to talk about ELDs, and more specifically, 5 of the most common ELD-related violations that are continuing to come up in roadside inspections and compliance reviews. So stay tuned, and if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button below so you can stay up to date on all of our DOT-related content. So although the FMCSA's electronic logging device rule has now been on the books for over 3 years, I'm often surprised how regularly carriers and their drivers are cited for violations of what I consider to be pretty fundamental and easily rectified ELD issues. Allowing these violations to persist can result in high hours of service CSA scores, out-of-service orders, civil penalties, and even a potential DOT audit. So I wanted to explore the most common ELD-related violations and, more importantly, the steps carriers and drivers can take to avoid them. So let's take a look at the top 5. So coming in first on our list is failing to utilize an ELD when one is required. Now, according to FMCSA data, of the approximately 1,149,000 driver-related roadside inspections conducted thus far in 2021, well over 14,000 of those inspections have resulted in a violation of Section 395.8A of the federal safety regulations for operating a CMV without an ELD when one is required. Now, in terms of ELD-related issues, it doesn't really get more fundamental than knowing when an ELD is required. In that regard, Part 395 of the Federal Safety Regulations provides that all drivers of CMVs in interstate commerce, subject to only a few exceptions which we will address shortly, must utilize an ELD to record their duty status each day. A CMV for these purposes includes the following. Number 1, vehicles or combinations with a GVWR, GVW, GCWR of 10,001 pounds or greater. Vehicles designed or used to transport 9 or more passengers for compensation, or 16 or more passengers not for compensation, and vehicles of any size or weight used to transport placardable quantities of hazmat. So if you're a driver that operates a CMV falling into one of these 3 categories in interstate commerce, then you're generally required to utilize an ELD. And even if you only operate in intrastate commerce, many states in the country have enacted their own ELD requirements similar to the federal requirements. Now, with that said, we noted earlier that the federal ELD mandate contains a few exemptions. They are, number 1, driveway tow-away operations where the vehicle driven is the commodity being delivered. Number 2, CMVs of model year 1999 or older. And number 3, drivers who are subject to the records of duty status requirement 8 times or fewer in a rolling 30-day period. Now, the first 2 exemptions on this list are fairly self-explanatory, but I'll pause briefly to address the third, which is really intended to encompass short-haul drivers. Now, as you may know, drivers who qualify under the so-called short-haul exemption have historically been exempt from the records of duty status, also known as driver logging requirement, while operating within the bounds of that particular exemption. However, on days when a short-haul driver exceeds the scope of the short-haul exemption, he or she has to complete a driver log for that day. So with that in mind, the last ELD exemption here allows these drivers to exceed the scope of the short-haul exemption up to 8 times in a 30-day period without having to utilize an ELD to track their duty status on the days that they do. They can instead use paper logs for those days. But if the driver proceeds to exceed the scope of that exemption a 9th time in the 30-day period, then he or she would have to utilize an ELD. So the takeaway here is that carriers and drivers need to familiarize themselves with the ELD rule and understand to whom it applies. Now, generally speaking, that includes all CMV drivers who are subject to the federal safety regulations, except those falling under one of the limited exemptions that we just discussed. So next up on the list of common ELD pitfalls is the inability of drivers to electronically transfer their ELD records to law enforcement during a roadside inspection. Now, of the 1,149,000 or so driver-related roadside inspections, over 11,000 of them involve this particular violation. Now, the ability to electronically transmit ELD data to law enforcement is a technical requirement of all ELDs. The idea behind it is to facilitate an easier and smoother review by law enforcement of a driver's records of duty status to sniff out hours of service violations. Now, according to the ELD technical specifications, ELDs must be capable of electronically transferring logs in one of 2 ways. The first option is a telematics transfer type ELD. Now, at a minimum, it must electronically transfer data to an authorized safety official on demand via wireless web services and email. Now, the second option is a local transfer type ELD, and at minimum, it must electronically transfer data to an authorized safety official on demand via USB 2.0 and Bluetooth. Now, although a particular violation is often written up as the ELD itself not being capable of transferring data, my hunch is that drivers at issue in the vast majority of these roadside inspections just weren't familiar with the process for doing so. So as we'll see in the next item on our list, drivers are required to have documentation with them in their CMVs explaining how to, among other things, transfer data to law enforcement. So this really should be a pretty easy fix. Carriers should ensure that their drivers are properly trained on ELD functionality, including how to electronically transfer ELD data to law enforcement during a roadside inspection. So next up on our list is failing to have the proper ELD documentation in the cab of the CMV. Now, according to Section 395.22H of the Federal Safety Regulations, CMV drivers who are subject to the ELD rule must have the following documentation with them in their vehicles. First up, a user's manual for the driver describing how to operate the ELD. Then an instruction sheet describing the data transfer mechanisms supported by the ELD and a step-by-step instruction to produce and transfer the driver's hours of service records to an authorized safety official. Then we have an instruction sheet for the driver describing ELD malfunction reporting requirements and record-keeping procedures during ELD malfunctions. And then we have a supply of blank paper driver logs sufficient to record the driver's duty status and other related information for a minimum of 8 days. Now, of the over 1 million driver-related roadside inspections conducted year to date, over 23,000 resulted in a violation of one or more of these requirements. So luckily, this is another easy one for carriers and drivers to fix by simply ensuring that the required documents are in the cab of the vehicle. Now, with respect to the user manual and the instruction sheets, these can even be kept electronically on the ELD itself or the driver's mobile device. But the key is that the driver needs to know how to readily access them and show them to law enforcement upon demand. So next on the list, another fairly common ELD pitfall is failing to properly mount a portable ELD in a fixed position that is visible to the driver from the driver's seat. More specifically, Section 395.22G of the Federal Safety Regulations provides that if a driver uses a portable ELD, the motor carrier shall ensure that the ELD is mounted in a fixed position during the operation of the CMV and is visible to the driver when the driver is seated in the normal driving position. Now, ELDs come in essentially two varieties, those that are hardwired to the vehicle and permanently mounted to the dash, and those that are portable in nature, including some where the interface is on one of the driver's smartphone or tablet devices. It's this latter group of ELDs that can cause issues here, particularly when the ELD software is just running on a driver's smart device. It's certainly tempting to just toss that device in the passenger seat or elsewhere in the vehicle, but the rule is that the device must be mounted in a place that is visible to the driver while the driver is seated in the driving seat. Again, this is another issue that's fairly easy to remedy. Even if drivers are utilizing ELDs on their smart devices, it's easy and usually cheap enough to purchase a window or dash mount for those devices to avoid this violation in the future. So last on our list, and likely the most difficult for carriers to get under control, is unassigned drive time, which refers to situations where an ELD captures vehicle motion with no authenticated driver logged into the system. Now, according to the ELD technical specifications, ELDs must be capable of recording vehicle driving time that is not attributed to a particular driver under an unidentified driving account. The purpose of this requirement is to dissuade carriers and drivers from concealing hours of service violations by either unplugging an ELD device or failing to log in the first place. So in those situations, the ELDs will continue logging the driving time and will place it in an unidentified driver account, which is subject to audit by law enforcement during a roadside inspection or during a carrier compliance review. Now, for their part, motor carriers have an ongoing obligation to review their ELD's unassigned drive time report and to reconcile all time placed on that account. Now, this can be a bear of a task if carriers don't do so regularly and have processes in place to ensure that drive time is properly assigned to the correct driver in the first place. Now, one way to cut down on unassigned drive time is to ensure that drivers are properly trained on logging into the system prior to operating a CMV and then taking appropriate action against drivers who routinely fail to do so. Now, also, the ELD systems themselves are built to facilitate the proper recording of unassigned drive time in the sense that when they record unassigned drive time, they must prompt the next driver who logs into the system to either accept the unassigned drive time as his or her own or decline it. Now, this is extremely helpful in situations where a driver inadvertently failed to log into the system. Now, that said, in situations where no authenticated driver has claimed the unassigned drive time as his or her own, carriers should be periodically reviewing and reconciling that time. Otherwise, they're setting themselves up for potential log falsification violations and civil penalties in the context of an audit. So that wraps up our list of 5 common ELD-related violations and the steps that carriers and drivers can take to cut down on them. Carriers who take care to ensure that their drivers know how to properly utilize ELDs will fare much better during roadside inspections and in compliance reviews. Make sure you check out our website at trucksafeconsulting.com, where you'll find all kinds of educational materials on these types of topics, including our ebook, which provides a high-level summary of all of the federal safety regulations. And if you're interested in even more in-depth training on these regulations, make sure you take a look at our innovative online courses over at trucksafeacademy.com, including our Hours of Service mini course. As always, thanks for watching.